Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to emphasize that the cherem of 1656 is not actually the only ban on Spinoza, and that it's very important to set the cherem, the ban on Spinoza, within the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam within a wider context of the problematic character of Spinoza's philosophy for his time, the 17th century, and perhaps for the problematic character of his philosophy in a much wider and more universal sense. So in the year 1678, the States General, the supreme authority of the United Provinces, of the government of the Dutch Republic, imposed a general ban on Spinoza's books. It doesn't matter whether you're Christian or you're Jewish or you're something else, nobody should be reading Spinoza. Spinoza is fundamentally subversive of the most important principles of society. Well, what are those, you might ask, since the States General, of course, was a political body, but it's clear in the reasons that it gives why the supreme political authority of the United Provinces is banning Spinoza's books, and no one is allowed to sell, to reprint. These are punishable offenses, and the punishments were quite serious. We know, you should be clear about that. This is not some kind of theoretical or symbolic or notional decree. In the decades following 1678, down to the early 18th century, we have got lists of printers, of booksellers in Amsterdam and in other Dutch cities. If you sold Spinoza's books, if you reprinted them, and you most certainly, you would be severely punished, quite serious sentences of imprisonment for several years and very heavy financial fines. This is not allowed to propagate Spinoza's ideas. Obviously, they couldn't be used, it goes without saying, in teaching, and couldn't be referred to respectably in any books of the time. The reasons given were that this is a philosophical conception that undermines not just religious authority, although I agree with all the previous speakers that this is the nub of the matter. That was what was chiefly objected to. But also the foundations of religious belief, because these are books that rule out miracles, which make revelation an impossibility. Revelation can have no meaning if you accept Spinoza's equation of God with the totality of everything that is, or God with nature. Then there can't be a knowing, benevolent God who governs the course of history. Therefore, there can't be a revelation. Therefore, the moral order is not something which is revealed to us by divine authority, by God. The moral order in Spinoza's philosophy is actually a social device. Morality, the moral order that we accept, is something that humans devise in order to make their communities workable and viable. So the success of our societies depends on a moral order, which is terribly important to Spinoza. That's why his most important book is called The Ethics. But moral authority is not something delivered, it's not something revealed to mankind by divine authority. And because of the non-providential character of God in Spinoza's philosophy, because God is not a knowing or benevolent force that reveals the moral order or rewards or punishes or can redeem men, there is no supernatural process of redemption. Such a thing doesn't exist. The path, the individual's path to correct belief and individual redemption is impossible within the framework of Spinoza's philosophy. And on this ground, the Dutch government absolutely forbade the printing, the selling, the reading, the use of Spinoza's books. It's not allowed by authority. That's irrespective of which church you belong to or which religious sect you show allegiance to. So now I want to emphasize this because it seems to me that one cannot get round the total rejection of religious authority in Spinoza. He is actually, he's certainly not the first philosopher whose philosophy entails a generalized rejection of religious philosophy. But he is most certainly the first philosopher in the history of the world who combines a system of thought which involves a generalized rejection of divine authority with a democratic political theory, Spinoza is terribly important not just as a philosopher, a general philosopher, but also as a political theorist. And what he's saying about political theory is that they rest on principles, a moral order, and a political system which are not delivered to us by higher authority. They don't come about by supernatural means. They're not based on revelation. They are devices. Both the democratic system itself and the moral principles that underpin it are devices which humans contrive or devise in order to create a workable system, a society that works. And this means that the origins of democratic theory in early modern times, rightly or wrongly, and that a lot of that, of course, depends on your individual perspective, nevertheless are inseparably entwined with rejection of religious authority. Now, we don't normally think, of course, of democratic principles as in some way as being intimately connected with the rejection of religious authority. But I just want to expand on this a little bit, use my time to explain what that really means in a Spinozistic context, and then finally come at the conclusion of my remarks to how it seems to me that means a Jewish response to the question whether the ban, the cherem on Spinoza of 1656, should today, in our present context, be lifted or not. So Spinoza begins his most famous political book, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, by explaining that the problem with religious beliefs is not just that they are intellectually or scientifically unfounded, and there's a considerable possibility or probability, as he would say, that they're not true, but that these are very easily misused, perverted by not necessarily legitimate authorities, but groups or individuals who set themselves up as tyrants or despots or political authorities claiming legitimacy for their oppression and despotism over society, which is not deserved, but they make it appear deserved and legitimate in the eyes of the population by using their, what he calls in that preface, their superstition and their credulity, their beliefs, so that the fact that people's beliefs may be untrue is also something very dangerous to everybody, to the whole of society, because that is the most effective resource available to would-be despots, tyrants, in subjecting society as a whole to oppression. In fact, he says I believe this is the most important point that he makes in the preface to the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, that if you want to resist tyranny, if you set out to reverse despotism, if you are an opponent of oppression, then you have to oppose superstitious and credulous beliefs where those are mobilized into a collective force used illegitimately by political authorities as a device for reinforcing political oppression over society. That's really the very heart of his political theory. Remember that he lived in a context of the Dutch revolt against Philip II. He talks quite a lot about Philip II, the revolt, and Spanish tyranny in the Tractatus. He lived in the time of Oliver Cromwell. He talks about what he saw as the failures or the inadequacies of the English Revolution and the unpleasant aspects or the negative aspects of Cromwell's dictatorship. He's lived in the time of Louis XIV, and nothing was clearer, not just to Spinoza, but to his audience, whether it's a Protestant audience, a Jewish audience, or a Catholic audience. I believe that in the third quarter of the 17th century, when Spinoza wrote his books, this is eminently clear to the public of that time, that when Louis XIV wants to impose his tyranny not just on France but on Europe, when Philip II wants to impose tyranny not just on Spain but on many other parts of Europe which were in one way or another dependencies of Spain, when Oliver Cromwell wants to, I think Spinoza's phrase is, sets himself up as a king under another name, what you use are the religious beliefs of the population. The essence of Louis XIV's despotism is the way he combined a certain way of interpreting Catholic ecclesiastical authority as an adjunct to absolute royal government. And this is what Spinoza is trying to undermine and destroy with his political theory. Now, I think that from the point of view of a Dutch republic, as it was, of course, after the downfall of the De Witts and what was sometimes called the true freedom, from the point of view of a Dutch republic which was in compromise with the House of Orange, with the monarchical principle up to a certain point, and certainly in alliance with the public church, the Reformed Church, they were correct to say that Spinoza's theories were fundamentally subversive of the principles of the Republic. They were, in fact, fundamentally subversive of the principles of every regime in early modern Europe. And I think Spinoza was right to say that if you want to set up a democratic republic, you not only, of course, the problem of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century was that its support was not broad enough. You not only have to broaden its support and create what we today call the Democratic Republic, but you have to weaken the mobilization of religious beliefs as a political tool or as a social tool. Or as he puts it, you have to weaken and undermine superstition and credulity. If you don't do that, then it is impossible to oppose tyranny and overthrow despotism or to resist political and social oppression. You can't without achieving that process. So I think the States General were correct in their estimation of what was involved and why this ban was needed. I do think, to follow the comments that were made earlier, that from the point of view of Jewish tradition and Jewish orthodoxy, and from the point of view of Jewish observance, to rescind the ban on Spinoza today is in some way a contradiction or a meaningless thing, which really doesn't have much logic or sense to it. I'm sure Spinoza would be the first to say that this happening all these centuries later is absurdly apologetic and feeble, given the context of where we are now and where society was then. It doesn't make very much sense. So I think from the perspective of orthodoxy, that's correct. But I'd also like to say, since nobody so far in the comments today, and I'll finish with this, has mentioned Reform Judaism, or as the predominant tradition, that Jewish tradition normally in the Netherlands today is called the liberale Joodse gemeenschap, but I mean now not what is sometimes referred to in America as Reform Judaism, but I mean the real tradition of Reform Judaism, going back to Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century, to the Enlightenment, and to what was originally, of course, a German and Central European Jewish Reform tradition. If you want to make fundamental changes in the structure and system of Judaism, make it a different kind of observance, try to adjust Jewish tradition and heritage to the Enlightenment, because that's what Reformed Judaism is about, then I think the perspective is quite different. Religious authority doesn't have the same meaning or significance that it had in 1656. So from the perspective of Reformed Judaism, I think it makes thoroughly good sense to lift the ban and to rescind it. It's not just good publicity, it's more than that. It fits in with the logic of what Reformed Judaism does. So as with so many things, whether we lift the ban or not is entirely dependent, I think, on your own individual perspective, and that it is very difficult to give an overarching answer which is going to be fully valid and fully true for everybody. Thank you very much.